I'm Dr. Lisa Wea, pastor of the New Bethlehem Baptist Church located in the Sandtown Winchester community of West Baltimore, where 5 years ago, Freddie Gray lived and died in police custody. Baltimore indeed is no stranger to the unrest and uprising that is occurring in our nation and around our world that have been precipitated by the pre-existing conditions that have plagued our urban communities where persons of color live for decades. Therefore, we need a federal jobs guarantee. We need a new Green Deal. We need Medicare for all, that our families may be strengthened and that our communities may be uplifted.
Since 1968, black unemployment has run twice as high as white unemployment. We need a federal jobs guarantee that will ensure that everyone in the shores of America that wants a job can have a job that pays a livable wage. We have learned in the midst of this crisis that our government can create money at the stroke of a key. Trillions of dollars were created to bail out millionaires, billionaires, and their corporations. That same government can create money to create a job for everyone in this country. It is what Dr. King calls the federal government as the employer of last resort.
Hi, my name is Delman Coates, founder of the Our Money campaign, and I want to welcome you to this training entitled Towards a Policy Agenda for Equity and Economic Sustainability. The purpose of this session and the goal of the Our Money campaign is to build public support for broad-based spending proposals that will address social and economic disparities in our nation, disparities that will benefit black and brown communities, poor and minority communities all across the country. Secondly, the purpose of this session is to answer the core and foundational question of public finance, and that is, how are we going to pay for these broad-based spending proposals? As activists and organizers, whenever we meet with elected officials, that is the one question that we need to be able to answer. And the principles that you will learn in this session will help and aid you in answering that question. Thirdly, the goal of this session is to train social justice advocates on the core mechanics of monetary and fiscal policy, so that you'll be able to dismantle the economic frameworks that have been used to deny us equal opportunity as it relates to public spending. Our campaign has been organizing for several years now. We officially launched in May of 2019, meeting with elected officials and local organizers. We've also brought together the public in a series of marches and rallies to advocate for policies related to full employment, health care, and other spending proposals that will benefit the American people. We have also had a legislative strategy in which we have been building support for the core framework and the policies we're going to talk about today with members of Congress. And lastly, we have brought together and have been training African American faith and civil rights leaders on the core foundational tenets of modern monetary theory as we move to build broad-based support for the policies we're going to talk about today. We're committed to influencing the influencers. Those of you who are watching this video have a passion for a range of issues that are facing your community, whether it's unemployment, public education, health care, more investments in underserved communities, whatever it is. And our goal is to influence the influencers by equipping you with an understanding of the core message of modern monetary theory and how it relates to the issue you're passionate about. Lastly, our goal is that we want to engage in issue-based advocacy around an agenda, a specific public policy agenda that leads to equity and economic sustainability. I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to train you and to share with you these core principles so that you can understand the core tenets of modern monetary theory and the power of the public purse. Now, those of you who know me know that I am a pastor, I'm a faith leader. My training is in religion, and you might wonder what qualifies me to talk about issues of macroeconomics. which is why over the past 2 or 3 years, we have assembled a team of economic experts and researchers to provide us guidance on the issues you're going to learn today. We have a robust and a diverse panel of economists and economic researchers, and whether they officially or formally designate themselves as MMT economists or not, the core framework that you're going to learn today are principles that we have derived and assembled from our team of economic advisors. You know, as I think about the work that's before us today, I'm reminded of a quote that Dr. King uttered in the aftermath of the riots in the 60s. He was quoting Victor Hugo. And Dr. King said this. He said, "If a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but the one who causes the darkness." Dr. King was committed to understanding what are the causative issues that are facing us today in society. And we believe that an understanding of monetary and fiscal policy at a macroeconomic level really speak to the underlying issues that are causing the range of systemic issues and challenges we face in our society. So what are the policy proposals that you're going to hear about today? Well, first, the policies that we're organizing around are designed to address the following issues facing our country, and in particular, facing Black America. Issues of high unemployment and underemployment, disparities and lack of access to quality health care, disparities in public education. We also want to address issues of economic injustice in poor and minority communities, issues surrounding economic empowerment, income inequality, wealth concentration, and the underinvestment in the priorities affecting Black America. This agenda also seeks to address excessive household and student loan debt due to predatory lending practices and our unnecessary reliance on money created through private bank lending. As a result, there are a range of economic threats to the Black family as a result of a lack of opportunity. And many in our community and in our country are concerned about mass incarceration as it results from a lack of jobs and a lack of opportunity. Additionally, America is facing a crumbling infrastructure and the lack of mass transit, particularly in underserved communities. And our plan and our proposal is also designed to support Black businesses, to support small, minority-owned and women-owned businesses and entrepreneurs in our society. So the first proposal that we are organizing around, and we want to solicit your support, has to do with what is called a federal job guarantee. A federal job guarantee is a legal guarantee to a dignified job at a livable wage with benefits for every American who wants one. That's right. The federal government would make it as a matter of public policy, a matter of the law, to provide public sector jobs at every level for every American that desires one. The goal of a federal job guarantee is to eliminate involuntary unemployment in the country. As I am recording this, over 41 million Americans have currently filed for unemployment benefits. And this could be a critical policy proposal that would help us to address the broad unemployment facing our country today, which the private sector is not able to address. The second benefit of a federal job guarantee is to improve wages and benefits for those who are already employed. As you know, those workers, when they try to negotiate for a better wage, face challenges from corporations and companies because there's no incentive for a corporation to raise the wage of workers from $10 to, let's say, $20 if there's a huge pool of unemployed people who will gladly take $9 an hour. So a federal job guarantee would take up that slack in the labor market so that we could help put a floor to wages and benefits and actually improve wages, and benefits. The third benefit of a federal job guarantee is to end the economic and racial scapegoating that we also see in the marketplace as a result of labor competition. When we have a federal job guarantee, then people of certain groups don't have to feel that others are a threat to taking their job. This is something that we currently see where people, whether it's immigrants or people of a different class, are oftentimes scapegoated as being individuals who stand as threats to take our job. Well, if every American is guaranteed a dignified job with benefits, whether that job comes from the private sector or the public sector, then there's no need for this kind of economic and racial scapegoating. The second policy that we're organizing around is Medicare for all. As we know, there are many Americans who are struggling because they don't have adequate or sufficient health care. Medicare for all provides single-payer health care, federally funded health care to every American, free at the point of service. Now, I want to be clear, Medicare for all is about universal health care and not universal health insurance. It is about the federal government being the single payer of that health care. There are no networks, no premiums, no deductibles, and no co-pays. And while there are some people who have talked about Medicare for all, meaning that people would no longer be able to have their private insurance, and there are some advocates of Medicare for all who talk about this, we don't see any reason why a Medicare for all plan can't be supplemental to or supplemented by individuals desiring to have private health insurance. Medicare for all is critical because it ends the unnecessary loss of life and bankruptcy due to lack of health coverage. The third policy that we are organizing around that we think ought to be foundational in our vision towards equity and economic sustainability is the Green New Deal. Through a 10-year national mobilization, the Green New Deal addresses our planet's greatest existential threat to get us to zero house emissions, and in the process, creating millions of good, high-wage jobs, and investing in the infrastructure and industry of the United States to sustainably meet the challenges of the 20th century related to perhaps our greatest existential threat, and that's climate change. In the process, we need to secure clean air and water, climate and community resiliency, healthy food, access to nature and protecting our environment, and making sure that we're able to leave the planet to our children, our grandchildren, and our great-great-grandchildren. A Green New Deal also seeks to promote justice and equity by stopping the oppression of indigenous peoples and communities of color, migrant communities and deindustrialized communities and depopulated rural communities at the same time. So a Green New Deal is key to one of our policy goals as well. The fourth area of our campaign has to do with education. Education is really key, and there are many of you listening right now who are deeply concerned about disparities in public education. Many of you know that right now these disparities are caused by the way in which public education is funded, which is largely through state and local taxes, which is why we're proposing that public education from pre-K through college, including support for HBCUs, be funded by the federal government, not by state and local taxes. This would help to eliminate, certainly significantly reduce the disparities in public education that we see all across the country. The second plank of our educational policy has to do with abolition of student loan debt. Right now, young people take out a loan to go to college, to get a degree, to get a job, to then work 20 or 30 years to pay back that loan. We think this is deeply problematic, and we see as key to moving our country forward the need to abolish student loan debt. Fifth, we believe that it's critically important that there be more federal funding for state and local priorities. Priorities such as unemployment benefits, hospital construction, school construction, mass transit, and get this, the funding of the $4.6 trillion infrastructure improvements that have been recommended by the American Society of Civil Engineers. We believe that that money should come from the federal government right now. And in so doing, we can rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, protect our waterways and streams, and in the process, create incredible jobs for the American people. The last aspect of our policy agenda has to do with economic empowerment. We believe that the policies I've just mentioned, a federal job guarantee, Medicare for all, federal funding for public education pre-K through college, federal funding for state and local priorities will go a long way towards increasing Black wealth, increasing support for Black businesses, reducing household debt, reducing the tax burden as well. Now, I imagine that many of you listening to me right now are wondering, how would the federal government pay for all of that? As you know, that whenever we meet with elected officials, that's the one thing that those who represent us at the federal level and at every level are going to want to ask. How are we going to pay for all of these broad-based spending proposals? This question of the pay for, where's the money going to come from, is the foundational question in public finance. And if you are an advocate, an organizer, faith leader, or civil rights leader, it is critically important that you be prepared and equipped to answer that foundational question. The question of where the money is going to come from oftentimes becomes the main obstacle in getting funding for these broad-based spending proposals that would tremendously benefit the communities that we serve. And so it's critically important that we understand that. To our detriment, we have been misled about the federal government's capacity to invest in public priorities due to the way in which mainstream economists and policymakers have relied on outdated economic assumptions, which is why it's critically important that you listen to the principles and core tenets that you're going to learn today so that you'll be adequately equipped to respond, to dismantle, and deconstruct the arguments that you'll often hear from opponents. Modern monetary theory is not an alternative economic system. Modern monetary theory is a powerful description of how our economy actually works today. And the reason modern monetary theory is so critical and is so powerful for those of us who are committed to public engagement, equity, and economic sustainability is that it leads us to radically different conclusions about the capacity of the federal government to invest in the priorities that we deeply care about. We're often told that we cannot fund Medicare for all, that there's no way we could fund a federal job guarantee, that there's no way we could have federal funding for public education pre-K through college because it's unaffordable. We don't have enough tax revenue. Well, the reason you need to understand the core tenets and aspects of modern monetary theory is that it's going to lead you to radically different conclusions about what we call the power of the public purse, the capacity of the federal government to invest in these priorities. So what I want you to do is I want you to sit back, relax, and get ready, because you are about to unlearn everything that you have learned about money and how our economy actually works. So I want to share with you now the 5 tenets of modern monetary theory, or MMT. MMT has been covered extensively recently over the past several months and years in the financial press. And I encourage you to research modern monetary theory in a range of credible outlets in the financial media. They've been covering the way in which what we have been seeing in our society as it relates to the stimulus packages and the huge public spending that we have seen recently is a vindication of the core framework of modern monetary theory. Tenet number 1. The first tenet of modern monetary theory, which I think is a tremendous game changer, is that the United States is a currency issuer, not a currency user. Now, I want you to understand this. You and I, as individuals, or your business, or your city or state, we are users of currency. In order for us to spend, we have to be in possession of some currency first in order to spend. But the federal government is not a currency user. We have a sovereign government here in the United States. And the United States is the sovereign issuer of our currency. And our capacity to issue the currency was strengthened in 1971 when the United States of America went off the gold standard. Prior to that time, all of those green dollar bills needed to be backed by gold somewhere. Many of you know that in Fort Knox, the nation, collect and stockpiled gold because in principle, in theory, the capacity of the federal government to create those green dollar bills was constrained and limited by the need to have gold somewhere. Well, in 1971, the U.S. went off the gold standard. And that really changed the game as it relates to the capacity and the ability of the federal government now to create money for the things that we need. So the core tenet number one is that the U.S. is a currency issuer, not a currency user. And as a result, the capacity of the federal government is no longer constrained. Therefore, if the federal government is a currency issuer, not a currency user, and I need you to get this, the United States of America cannot go broke. The U.S. cannot become insolvent, as is commonly believed by politicians, the public, unless of a political decision to do so. This is very powerful because many politicians use the idea that we could go broke as a basis, as a reason for underspending on the things that we need. Think about this. As currency users, as individuals, if we have an obligation or a debt to pay, we can't just create the money for it. We have to use it or have it first. However, the federal government, because it is a currency issuer, if it has a bill to pay, if it has a debt to pay, it can just create the money for it. I want to share this video from Professor Stephanie Kelton. She is an economist at the Stony Brook University, and I want to share these words from Professor Kelton.
So MMT starts with a simple observation, and that is that the U.S. dollar is a simple public monopoly. In other words, the United States currency comes from the United States government. It can't come from anywhere else. So what that means is that the federal government is nothing like a household. In order for households or private businesses to be able to spend, they've got to come up with the money, right? And the federal government, it can never run out of money. It cannot face a solvency problem, bills coming due that it can't afford to pay. It never has to worry about finding the money in order to be able to spend.
Now that we're clear that the United States is a currency issuer, not a currency user, we're now ready for tenet number two. And the second tenet that I want to share with you today is that the federal government is not a household. Say that with me. The government is not a household. Now, when we say the government is not a household, we're talking about the federal government, not state and local governments. Now that we're clear about that, it is important for us to understand that most mainstream economists tend to think about the capacity of the federal government to spend based upon how they think about a household budget. In your home, in your business, in your churches, mosques, and synagogues, in your local and state governments, you need revenue first in order to spend. But if the U.S. is a currency issuer, not a currency user, it's not like a household. And so therefore, the federal government does not need revenue first in order to spend. Those of you listening, perhaps you remember the stimulus packages that that the Congress passed in March and April of 2020. And you saw the way in which the federal government literally created $3.5 trillion without having a source of revenue first in order to do that. The federal government has the capacity to just create the money that it needs. I want to share this brief video from former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke about the capacity and the ability of the federal government's bank to just create money.
The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
So once again, I want you to understand that the government is not a household. The government is not a household. Therefore, if the government is not a household, then taxes don't fund spending, as we are often told. We're often told that the federal government needs tax revenue first in order to spend. But the fact of the matter is spending has to take place first in order for the public to have the money it needs to spend. That's really a radical reorientation of everything that we have been taught. I want you to think about this. Imagine that right now the federal government was starting. Imagine that the United States of America, at whatever time you're watching this, is starting right now. And let's say at that moment, it decided it wanted great schools and hospitals, clean air, roads and bridges, arts and culture. Well, the federal government would not be able to tax the public first in order to spend until it creates the money first. It has to put the money in circulation. It has to create the dollar, put it in circulation by paying people for the things that we need in society. And then once the people have the money, they can then pay their taxes. So MMT helps us to understand that taxes don't fund spending. Instead, spending must come first. Now, the third tenet of modern monetary theory is this, that deficit spending is the way in which the federal government creates money. That's right. Deficit spending is what we call net public money creation. Say that with me. Deficit spending is net public money creation. What is a deficit? A deficit is defined as spending more than you generate in revenue. This is a very important principle because in many public policy discussions, you will hear many elected officials decrying the notion of deficit spending. You will hear them talk about things like, we need to reduce deficit spending. We need to pay off the federal debt. But actually, we understand now that deficit spending is the way in which the federal government puts money in circulation. I want to share with you an illustration that illustrates this very principle. There you see on the left the federal government, and on the right, you see a teacher. Now imagine that the federal government pays the teacher $1,000 for, let's just say, a week's worth of salary. And then I want you to imagine, just for the sake of illustration, that teacher pays $500 in taxes back to the federal government. Well, in that transaction, you will see at the bottom that the federal government is now has a $500 deficit, right? It spent $1,000 and received back $500 in tax revenue. So it now has a $500 deficit. Now, on the other side of the ledger, the teacher has $500 left over in surplus. She was paid $1,000, she paid back $500 in taxes, and she now has $500 surplus left over. And with that $500 surplus, the teacher can pay for the things that she needs. She can buy dinner for her family. She can put a little away for a vacation. She can save some for later for a business. And the more deficit spending that takes place in this scenario, then the more surplus the teacher has. This is why we say that deficit spending is net public money creation. It is the way in which the federal government puts money in circulation for the benefit of the non-government sector. That's you and that's me. Now, I want you to imagine another scenario. Let's imagine as conventional economists and policymakers say that the goal of the federal government is to try to have like a balanced budget. You've heard politicians talk about what we need is a balanced budget amendment. We need to reduce deficit spending so that the federal government's budget can be in balance. All right? So in this scenario, let's imagine the federal government's paying the teacher $1,000. Now, in order for the federal government's books to now be in balance, the federal government has to tax out $1,000 or tax back $1,000 from that teacher. That then leaves the federal government's balance as zero. And those who lead in that government and who are politicians can go around the country and campaign on being fiscally responsible with the federal government's budget. The problem now, though, is that the teacher now has no money left. She has no money left to spend on the things that she needs. And so while the federal government in this scenario, while their budget is balanced, the private sector, the individual in society, now has no money left. This scenario then leaves that teacher vulnerable to a range of other predatory practices. It also creates kind of hopelessness and despair economically for her as she tries to figure out how to get her needs met. Therefore, contrary to conventional economic and political thinking, we should want and advocate for the federal government to do more and not less deficit spending for the things that we need. I hope you're understanding that and how important that is. We should do more advocacy around public spending. And the way that the federal government does that is through deficit spending. And so we should be advocating for more of that. Therefore, while deficits are bad for households and businesses and local and state governments, deficit spending is in most cases economically good. And I'll explain later the one instance in particular in which it's not good. But in most instances, it is a good. It is an economic good because the government is not a household. Say that with me again. Principle number 2, the government is not a household. For the moment, I want to say that if deficits are net public money creation, then the way in which we have been told and taught to view the federal debt is completely wrong. The federal debt does not reflect an amount of money that the U.S. owes. Instead, the debt number is a reflection of the amount of money that the federal government has spent into society, has put in circulation through deficit spending. Just think for a moment in the first scenario we just saw, the $500 deficit was really a record of the amount of money that the federal government spent in society with that teacher. So the $500 is not the nation's debt. It is really a reflection of the nation's money supply, okay? So we've been misled about the federal deficit and the national debt posing constraints on federal spending. Every time advocates and organizers talk about more money for public education, more money to pay teachers, more money to rebuild schools and roads and hospitals, to create jobs, whatever it is, elected officials use this boogeyman of the federal deficit and the national debt as this false imaginary constraint on the federal government's capacity to spend on the things that we need. I want to show you this chart. It is a chart of sector balances in the United States from 1990 to 2017. And what you'll see there is that when the federal government is in deficit, and the lowest point on that line you'll see is circled, the red line circled, around 2009. you'll see that when it's at its lowest point, the corresponding green line for the private sector, that's households and businesses, you and me, right? The corresponding green line is at its highest point. I shared this chart to show you that the federal government's deficits lead to private sector surplus. So we should desire more and not less deficit spending by the federal government. So I want to share this video from several of our economic advisors who are on our advisory council, as they discuss this very concept of deficit spending.
Well, we have a lot of hyperbolic rhetoric about deficit spending or the federal deficit. And I think there are people who have this clock where they're trying to calculate the minute-to-minute increase in the federal deficit. And there's all kinds of warnings or forebodings that we're going to have a complete disaster if the federal budget continues to run in deficit terms. But deficit spending simply means that the government is engaging in a higher level of expenditure than the amount of tax revenues that it's taking in. And this can happen on an annual basis so that there could be a cumulative growth in the debt and the deficit. But whether or not that's a bad thing is really contingent on not the deficit in and of itself, but the way in which the deficit has been created. So for example, the Trump administration has expanded the federal deficit substantially, but they've done so by reducing taxes on the wealthiest Americans. And so I don't think that that's a very good way to engage in deficit spending. I think that there are some other ways in which we could engage in deficit spending for far more positive public purposes that would give us the capacity to produce additional national income that could support whatever tax revenue is required or needed on an ongoing basis.
The notion of deficit implies some sort of inadequacy. And deficit spending as it relates to creating greater inequality. So if one thinks about the tax cut that was recently passed, where we spent in excess of $2 trillion, and the resources from that will largely go to the wealthy, as opposed to perhaps those that might need it more, and perhaps those that are inhibited in their ability to engage in self-determination in their lives because they lack the resources. Well, I think deficit would be applicable in that scenario. But as it relates to thinking about something like putting Americans to work to build our infrastructure, which will have payoffs not only immediately in the sense that somebody would have a job with some adequate resources to have a fulfilling life, but it would be investing in America's future by building up that infrastructure, which will pay dividends down the road.
So the mainstream conventional wisdom or conventional thinking very much gets it wrong when it comes to what a federal deficit is and what it can do, right? So I think folks are inclined to hear deficit, oh, that's bad, that's a negative word, right? But everybody's deficit is someone else's surplus, right? And in fact, it's incumbent upon the government to spend money so that the non-government, everybody else, has the money. The question becomes, how are they doing that? Are they giving tax breaks to rich people like Trump? Are they spending it on a federal job guarantee? Is that the plan? So people are worried about the deficit when they should be really be worried about what the money is doing, right? It's not just how much money is out there, how much money is spent. What is the money actually accomplishing? And we wind up in these places where we're looking at the federal deficit without looking at the economy. Dr. Stephanie Kelton says we've got to use the deficit to balance the economy and not the other way around, and I wholeheartedly agree. This country and most countries with strong legal institutions have a history of the government defining what is money and being able to create money. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that the government has the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, right? And the Supreme Court has spent a long amount of time kind of drawing this out and eventually arrived at the notion that the government can spend as much money into the economy as it wants as the creator of the money. This was actually figured out after the Civil War in a series of cases called the legal tender cases during the Reconstruction era. What the Supreme Court sort of solidified was Abraham Lincoln's approach to financing the Civil War, right? Lincoln didn't have time to go gather foreign investment. He didn't have time to do X, Y, Z. And so what he did was issue greenbacks, which are the precursor to the paper money that we use today. And the Supreme Court found that not only was that legal, but just issuing paper currency without gold to back it, without necessarily taxes to back it, was a cornerstone of what it meant to have a government. So the fact that the government issues money and spends it without necessarily taking it from somewhere is something that strikes us as odd now, but doesn't strike other people as odd in other times in history and in other different places.
So what we've learned now is that deficit spending is the way that the federal government creates money. It is how the federal government puts money in circulation by spending it on the things that we need. Deficit spending, however, is not inherently good or bad when it comes to public outcomes. It's critically important that the people be involved in determining how that money is spent to ensure that good outcomes are achieved for the rest of the economy. The federal government can either deficit spend for the benefit of the rich and wealthy, or it can deficit spend for the benefit of the masses of the American people, or what is called by Professor Kelton and others, the rest of the economy. Therefore, we've got to be politically engaged. We have to be active and involved in asserting both the need for more deficit spending and to make sure that money is being spent on priorities that provide the greatest benefit for the public. So that deficit spending is not just being created for the benefit of those at the top through tax cuts, but that it's being spent for the benefit of the American people on things like job creation, healthcare, public education, protecting our environment, economic empowerment, and reducing household debt. All of the core tenets and platforms of our public policy agenda. Now, whenever we talk about more deficit spending, someone is oftentimes going to say, isn't there a limit to how much money the federal government can spend? Yes, there is a limit, but the limit is not what we have been told. We have been told that the limit on the federal government's capacity to spend is its budget revenue, the amount of money it brings in tax revenue. What we know now is that since the federal government is a currency issuer, not a currency user, since the federal government is not like a household, then the limit on the federal government's capacity to spend is not tax revenue. The federal government does not have to tax the public. It does not have to tax the wealthy, millionaires and billionaires, in order to spend on public priorities. So what is that limit? Well, the limit is inflation. Inflation is the limit on federal spending for the United States as a currency issuer. The federal government can create all of the money that we need. It creates the money for all of the things that we need. It can create all of the money that we need to address the range of social and economic challenges we face today. Countries that have faced issues of hyperinflation have encountered that problem because they are not a monetarily sovereign currency issuer like the United States. I note that because oftentimes when we talk about public money creation, many people will immediately begin to talk about countries like Zimbabwe. They'll talk about Weimar Germany in the past. They'll talk about Greece and the issues that were encountered in Argentina. All of these countries do not have the level of monetary sovereignty that the United States government has. They either issue their currency, but it's backed by, they borrow in another country's debt. They may issue the peso, but their pesos have to be backed by U.S. dollars. In Greece, they don't have monetary sovereignty by being a part of the Eurozone. So there are a range of other unique issues in all of these environments where hyperinflation was triggered that are in no way comparable to what the capacity that we have here in the United States. So you may be wondering, what happens if the federal government fails to do all of this? What happens if the federal government fails to provide us with an adequate money supply, if it fails to create money through public spending? Well, when that happens, public needs relating to jobs and healthcare, public education, needs related to addressing poverty do not get met. And that's so critically important. The things that we need are not paid for. They are not funded when the federal government underutilizes its power to create money for the things that we need. Secondly, when the federal government does not create enough money, social tensions as a result get exacerbated. And it feeds into this mindset that in order for us to have a social safety net, that only happens when the takers of society are taking from the tax money and tax revenue of the makers. It increases, it exacerbates this kind of class struggle between the makers, quote unquote, and the takers in society. Lastly, it also causes us to operate within this scarcity framework rather than an abundance framework. When we think that the federal government is like a household, we start to think of the federal government's budget and capacity to spend like our household budget. Look, I'm going to be honest. My pockets are not limitless to pay for the things that I may need and the things that I desire. And I imagine the same is for you as well. And when we think of the federal government's budget like a household budget, like the budget of a business or a nonprofit, it forces us to operate in this scarcity model, as if the federal government's budget is like this one limited pie, and we have to compete against one another for how that pie is going to be allocated. You oftentimes hear advocates talk about, well, we could get money for more public investments in education if we just take money from some other area of the budget, let's say the military or the police or something like this. And there might be legitimate reasons for reducing, military budgets and police budgets. Perhaps, I'm not saying that. But it feeds into this idea that in order to spend, the federal government has got to take the money from other places. When the fact of the matter is, the federal government's capacity to spend, because it is a currency issuer and not a currency user, does not have those kinds of constraints. It radically changes the way we think about the power of the public purse to address our greatest social challenges today. There is nothing that the federal government, as a result, cannot afford. There's nothing. We have been intentionally misled. And so you might be asking, why have we been misled in this way? If the federal government has, an almost limitless capacity, short of inflation, to create money for the things that we need, why haven't we been doing it? Why has the federal government been doing it? Who benefits from operating within this sort of economic framework of scarcity and austerity? I'm glad you asked. Because it's the financial sector, it's the banks that benefit from the conventional economic framework. See, whenever the federal government does not create enough money through public spending, it forces the public to rely on money created through bank lending. Remember in that illustration where in the balanced budget illustration that we shared a moment ago, where the U.S. government's books are now balanced, but now that teacher has no money left, yet she still has needs? Well, in order for her now to get her needs met for housing, for education, shopping, she now has to turn to some form of credit, some form of borrowing in order to get those needs met. And so the financial sector benefits whenever the government underutilizes the power of the public purse to put money in circulation. And what many people fail to realize is that most of what we think of and use as money in our society is bank credit. It's bank money and not public money. Some researchers, and this number is not firm, have attempted to place that percentage as over 80, some over 90% of what we think of and use as money in our society is bank credit. Think about it. The average person works 40 to 50 hours a week to pay interest on borrowed money. Some of our economic stress and strain at every level, whether it's households, businesses, state and local governments, comes as a result of the lion's share of our wealth, the result of our labor going to pay interest on borrowed money. Our campaign is really about changing this relationship. We are saying that we can have a society of economic sustainability and equity if we shift our relationship from money created through bank lending to money created through public spending. Having society depend on bank money causes a kind of economic bondage and servitude. Because that bank credit, that bank money has to be repaid with perpetual interest. And worst of all, money created as an interest-bearing debt causes society to function in an environment of scarcity. Think about this. If all of our money has to be repaid with perpetual interest, that means that the lion's share of our wealth is being siphoned. It's being extracted into the pockets of the financial sector, the banks that loan us this credit money. And if our money is being extracted and siphoned into the pockets of the financial sector, that's leaving us with less and less resources. It makes our economy a lot like musical chairs, where there's not enough chairs that I analogize to resources. There are not enough chairs or resources for the number of people in the game. And if we want to solve that kind of dynamic, if we have a musical chairs economy, the way that we solve it is not to just change the ethnicity, gender, class of the people in the chairs. We've got to put more chairs, more resources in the mix. And that's why our public policy agenda is designed to eliminate, to dismantle this economy, this musical chairs economy, by putting more chairs in the mix, by putting more jobs in the economy, by guaranteeing a job, by guaranteeing health care, by federally guaranteeing public education. And the way that we do that is to shift from a reliance on money created through bank lending to money created through public spending. Because the financial sector benefits from this over-reliance on money created through bank lending, this is the reason the financial sector, we would contend, is so heavily invested in furthering the miseducation, the misinformation about the power of the public purse and about the power of public spending. It's why it is so invested in supporting political candidates and economics departments that continue to talk about the nature of deficits in this conventional mainstream way, because it understands that whenever the federal government feels constrained in its capacity to create money when it deficit spends, then it forces the public to rely on money created through bank lending. These core economic tenets that I've shared with you today are critically important for our country, for Black and minority communities in particular, because our communities are disproportionately affected by an underinvestment in the priorities that we care about. Therefore, the public policy agenda that we've outlined for you today would significantly reduce the economic disparities in areas affecting the Black community, poor and minority communities, and really facing our nation. The second reason this issue is so critical is because an economy that relies on bank credit creates economic enslavement. Because rather than money being the servant of the people, when money is created through public spending, bank money makes the people servants to money due to having to repay that money in perpetual interest payments. I want those of you listening to assist us in a variety of ways. First, I want you to really take the time to understand the policy agenda we've outlined and the core economic framework we presented, because we want to ask you to help us to expand the adoption of this policy agenda. Many of you listening to me right now have relationships with faith-based organizations, civil rights organizations, sororities, fraternities, a range of other civic organizations. We want your organization to help us expand this cause by adopting a resolution that articulates a support for these policy priorities that we've outlined here today. And we want you to use that policy as the framework for your interaction and relationship with candidates for office. We want every organization to adopt a resolution expressing support for a federal job guarantee, Medicare for all, federal funding for public education, pre-K through college, including support for HBCUs, federal funding for state and local priorities, and economic empowerment models that would lead to greater support for Black businesses, reducing household debt, abolition of student loan debt as well, and reducing the tax burden, particularly on middle and low income families. We want you to grant us permission to use your name on statements to media outlets as we prepare opinion editorials and as we go around the country meeting with those who represent us at a national level. Grant us permission to use your name and the institution that you serve as a part of our outreach efforts. Then we want you to agree to call or email elected officials with prepared statements that we might develop. And then we want you to join us in lobbying in support of this specific policy agenda and support national candidates who support this campaign. Listen, those of you watching, if you have a question, a comment, if you have a suggestion, you can contact us by sending an email to contact@ourmoneyus.org. Thank you for taking the time today to listen to and to be a part of this training. We deeply believe that if we change the way we think about money, we can change the world. Thank you.